A movement begins in the motor cortex, which is the part of the brain that is responsible for muscle contraction and muscle movement. Here, a stimulus of chemical signals is released to pass down through neurons to the muscle, causing it to contract. All of this is described in this video. Scene 1. How an electrical signal is sent down to the neuron. A neuron is at rest at -70 millivolts, and then neurotransmitters bind to receptors on a dendrite, which causes neurons to depolarize, so the voltage of the neuron moves closer to 0 millivolts. At -55 millivolts, the threshold is reached and the sodium channels open, letting sodium ions pass into the neuron soma. The sodium ions are positively charged ions, which cause an action potential to then travel down the neuron. Once the peak is reached at 30 millivolts, the sodium channels close and instead the potassium channels open, so that potassium flows out of the cell. This causes the neuron to repolarize and then hyperpolarize, going past -70 millivolts so that another action potential can't be sent until the potassium channels close again, allowing the neuron to return back to rest. All the while, the action potential travels along the neuron until it reaches the axon terminal and stimulates the release of neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. This process is repeated to send the next action potential for a muscle contraction.
Scene 2. An action potential arrives at the motor end plate. Firstly, the action potential reaches the end of the neuron at the axon terminals. This causes the calcium channels to open so that the calcium diffuses into the axon terminal. Once this has occurred, the vesicles release the acetylcholine which they contained, and the acetylcholine then diffuses across the synaptic cleft and binds to receptors on the motor end plates. This binding opens the ion gates and causes sodium ions and potassium ions to diffuse into and out of the motor end plate. The sodium ions have a higher concentration in the synaptic cleft and therefore diffuse into the motor end plate, while the potassium ions diffuse out of the motor end plate and into the synaptic cleft. However, the concentration gradient of sodium ions is much greater than the concentration gradient of the potassium ions, so a lot more sodium diffuses into the motor end plate than potassium diffuses out, and this causes a change in the polarity. Once the threshold is reached due to the change in polarity, the action potential travels along the sarcolemma, and the acetylcholine then diffuses out of the synaptic cleft, or it could be broken down by acetylcholinesterase, so that it can be reused in the axon terminal for the next action potential. This final process is called the resynthesis of acetylcholine.
Scene 3. The action potential is in the muscle. When the action potential arrives at the muscle, it travels down the T-tubules. This stimulates the sarcoplasmic reticulum to open the calcium gates so that calcium can travel into the sarcoplasm. These calcium ions then bind to troponin, which allows the muscular contraction process to begin. Scene 4. Sliding filament theory. The troponin, which has calcium bound to it, changes shape and moves the tropomyosin away from the actin so that the binding sites are open. The myosin has ADP and insoluble phosphate at its head, which the myosin uses as energy to move to the actin and bind to the binding sites, forming a cross bridge. The cross bridges are strengthened as the insoluble phosphates are released. Next, the power stroke occurs, where ADP is released so the actin-myosin head pivots, and the myosin pulls the actin filament towards the center of the sarcolemma. An ATP molecule reattaches to the myosin head, and this causes the bond between myosin and actin to weaken, so the myosin pulls back its original position. With sufficient calcium, this process continues and repeats, with the ATP being converted to ADP and insoluble phosphate. As the cycle continues and repeats, the thin filaments move towards the center of the sarcolemma, and the muscle contracts and shortens. This process will only stop once the calcium is moved back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. A motor unit is made up of a motor neuron and the skeletal muscle fibers that are attached to it. Each of these muscle fibers has these actions occurring in them, and therefore a motor unit can produce so much more action because each of the individual fibers and each of the individual units contract at different points, and therefore a much larger contraction is created.